All right, so in the last video, we saw a couple of different ways of building up a web page entirely inside of the web browser. First using just plain old JavaScript, and then using some methods in the React package, such as create element. And we saw that using create element was certainly better than having to build up a web page by hand, but was still a whole lot more tedious than writing a straight up HTML file. So in this video, we're going to look at a JavaScript extension called JSX that addresses that problem and lets us put HTML right inside of a JavaScript file. And so at a very high level, JSX is just an extension to the JavaScript syntax that lets you put HTML code right inside of a JavaScript file. So here I loaded up jsx1.jsx. I'm using the JSX extension because that's what makes the Visual Studio Code syntax highlighter happy. If I just use JS, then it gets all screwed up. But there's nothing magic in general about the JSX syntax, and if you're using WebStorm or IntelliJ or something like that, you may find the JS extension works just fine. But what you can see here is I have a string, a hello world string. This looks like regular JavaScript, and now it's set equal to, well, a piece of HTML. So you can see how I have a piece of HTML kind of stuck right inside my JavaScript file. Likewise, I have another constant called myStates, and similarly, it's set equal to a piece of HTML code. Now, of course, a web browser isn't going to know what to do with this. This doesn't look like JavaScript, especially when we get to the HTML parts. So before we can run this in a browser, we need to convert JSX into just regular JavaScript. And so the tool we use to do that is called Babel. Let me show you on the web page if you haven't seen it before. It's a product, and as you can see here, it's bigger than React. It will turn one form of code into another. One of its first uses was to turn modern JavaScript into older styles of JavaScript for use in older browsers. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show you how you can run Babel by hand on your JSX code. Now, normally, of course, you don't need to do this while developing a React app. It happens behind the scenes, but I think it's useful to see what Babel is doing to take away some of the magic. And to do this, I'm actually going to switch over to a fresh directory. So this code here that we're looking at that's in the GitHub sample code already has npm set up and has some packages listed and so on. So I'm going to close this and switch over to a different directory outside of the GitHub space that I just kind of use on the side. And you can see here that it has just one file in it, just the JSX file. So if you were doing this from scratch and wanted to play along, the first thing you would need to do is initialize an npm project, and then you would have to install the Babel CLI package. That is Babel itself and some command line tools that we can use. And we also have to install a package called Babel Preset React. Now remember, Babel does all sorts of translations for JavaScript, not just React based, but it's, for example, also what would handle TypeScript if you were turning TypeScript into JavaScript, or if you were writing with the latest and greatest JavaScript features and you wanted to make sure they would run in older browsers, you could use Babel to change that into older style JavaScript code. So when you use Babel, you have to tell it what it's looking for and what kind of transformations it should run. And so rather than having to type out all that configuration by hand, the Babel people put out some packages with that configuration already set up, and that's what this package is. So now that that's installed, let me open my local copy of that same JSX file. I'm going to run the Babel command line. And then when we run it, we have to tell it what presets we're using, what kind of output we are looking for. So we're using the presets for React, of course. And then we can give it the name of the file, and it will spit out some JavaScript code. Let me do something a little different. Let me dump that out to a file so we can see it easier. We'll call it JSX1 out.js. All right, and now I can load that up as a JavaScript file. And we can see, so for example, the first line set hello world equal to this little paragraph. And so what happens when we transpile that with Babel is that JSX snippet is turned into a create element call. All right, what is it doing? It's creating a paragraph tag with the hello world text in it. And we can see that's what happened over here. We created a paragraph tag with the hello world text in it. Right? And then what's the other thing is we have something a little more complicated there. We have a div with a paragraph with a list, and in the output, what are we doing? We're creating a div, and it has some children. The first child is a paragraph. The second child is that unordered list, and the unordered list itself has some elements in it, which are the states that I put in over here. So JSX looks like this big fancy thing, but it's just syntactic sugar for a call to the create element React method. And it's really nice though, because it lets us type that HTML the way we are taught to think about it, as HTML, and then automatically convert it over into the JavaScript code. So now we're getting somewhere. Now we can create a web page that's created on the client side, but then we can use, for the most part, the familiar and useful HTML syntax instead of something that's much more dense and tedious to deal with. So let's look at another example. So I'll go back to the Git repo and I'll load up a second version. Now, much like EJS and the other templating languages we've looked at, because we're just generating JavaScript code, we also have a mechanism for inserting JavaScript code into the JSX we're writing. So here we're going to create some states, and I am creating some JSX here, but notice the first time I spelled out all the states by hand, but as we saw before, using loops might be nice. So I've got a div and a paragraph and the unordered list, but now I'm going to, instead of typing out all the states, I'm going to generate them with an array. So the curly braces there say what's in here is some JavaScript code, so it'll run the JavaScript code. It's doing the map like we saw before. So a string comes in, and what comes out is a piece of JSX, which is an li element containing that state. And yes, if you look carefully, you'll see that I've got JSX within JavaScript within JSX. So you can in fact nest stuff like that. And so we can do the same sort of thing. I'll come down here. Let me bring a copy of that over locally. And then let's run Babel on it. And we can see the result. Now, we don't get everything listed out, right? This is just JavaScript code. So again, we've got the create element with the div, and it has the paragraph inside of it. And when we do the create element here, they're not listed out because it is generated with JavaScript. So we have my JavaScript just gets dropped right in there inside the create element call at the right spot. Okay, so that's the starting point of React at a high level, is the special syntax called JSX that can get turned into JavaScript that can build a web page on the fly. So now you can write your code as more or less HTML, or maybe you want to think of it as EJS, like HTML with some JavaScript dropped into it, and it can be rendered on the client side as opposed to rendered by the server and sent over. Now, of course, at this point, it's still not clear what that buys us. And so that's what our next step will be, and I'm going to save that for the next video, is to build up an actual web page with React in a way that we can see why having React is potentially better than using EJS or some other server-side setup.